What's happening here?
It's shocking. Why in the world would he search for pornography right before he tries to assassinate Donald Trump? But I think what it speaks to is how addictive internet pornography is for this generation because of how common it is and easy to access. So kids don't even need to go looking for it anymore. It finds them on social media. And the nature of pornography is to addict its user. If it becomes so addictive, then it's not surprising when someone would be turning to their phone to search for it to get that next dopamine hit. And so I think what we have to understand about pornography is that it literally rewires the brain. And it rewires the brain in several different ways. The first is that it creates neural pathways that habituate the person to have to continue to access pornography because of such a high level of dopamine is released in the brain when they view this type of content, that it actually rewires the brain to need that level of dopamine and to actually crave it. So this neurotransmitter that's involved in really all sorts of addictive substances, it's released in the brain as a pleasure hormone, but it actually creates craving so that your brain will repeat that activity and do it again. And so I think what we have to understand is that this is not just, kids stumbling across, their uncle's Playboy, but the online interactive sexual experiences that children are being exposed to, which are extremely violent, are eliciting this dopamine response that is highly addictive, that rewires their brain to constantly crave and want more. And it also desensitizes the brain to the pleasures of the natural world because of the level of stimulation provided by the online pornography. They constantly crave it, they need more. And so then the normal, everyday, daily things around them don't elicit that response. And so they actually become desensitized to things in the real world. And so it's a really alarming problem that I don't actually think many people are paying attention to. I would call it the kind of stealth public health crisis of today, in the sense that it is having these mental and physical effects on children, especially at a stage when their brains are still developing. And so it's forming these people, habituating children into becoming addicts to something that is inherently harmful to them, to their bodies, to their brain. And I hope we can talk about, too, the social impact that this is having on children's relationships, formations, and just the societal level impacts we're seeing from kids accessing these types of content.
What you're describing, right, to me, that has an effect not just on children, but on adults. That same phenomenon happens. It's just that children's brains are a lot more plastic.
That's right.
Well, give me a sense of the scale of this. And of course, we're going to talk about kids today, but I do think a lot of what we're going to talk about kids actually applies to adults as well. Just like maybe the legal dimensions are a bit different, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, it's a great question. To your point about the plasticity of children's brains, that is, I think, why we're particularly focusing on kids, because their brains are still developing, and those neuron pathways are being formed. And if they're formed towards pornography, it's going to be very dangerous and hard for them to overcome. And so on the prevalence scale, it's very hard to measure these things. And a lot of the surveys that have been done are self-reported. They try to interview teenagers and try to understand, how many have accessed pornography, how often they're accessing it, did they come across it accidentally. And so, a recent survey from 2022 by Common Sense Media found that over 3/4 of teens have accessed pornography. The study was done on 13 to 17-year-olds. They found the average age of first exposure is 12. And the majority of these children are encountering for the first time accidentally, mainly through an online means, clicking a link that they didn't understand was going to send them to a pornographic website. So it's extremely prevalent, and part of this is, as I just mentioned, the kind of online means. Children today are carrying smartphones around in their pockets. They have 24/7 access to this type of content, and we've never had this before in history. It used to, historically, if children were to come across this, it'd actually be very difficult. They'd have to intentionally seek it out. But now, with social media, children don't need to go looking for pornography. It finds them, and it can quickly, a curious child just lingering over a post on social media can get quickly sucked down a dangerous rabbit hole of very inappropriate sexual content because the app's algorithms go to work and just continue to put more and more of that type of content into children's feeds. And we've seen that average age of first smartphone decrease over the years, where now I believe it's 10 years old. And so that average age of porn exposure being 12, I think is only going to decline further, that in the reality that we have given children literally mini computers in their pockets, tethered to them constantly, with access to all sorts of apps and the internet, where they're just stumbling across this horrific content.
And all sorts of things that will be very enticing potentially, but they can't remotely understand the consequences of basically and going down these rabbit holes. It's very disturbing to me. I'll share an anecdote. I was at a meeting where basically there was someone giving a presentation about some work they were going to do. They provided a website that you could check out and see what they were doing. Nothing to do with pornography. However, I must have entered something wrong on the website.
Oh,
and I'm sitting there with my iPad, right? And all of a sudden, there's some very not safe for work things happening on my iPad. I'm scrambling to hide it, right? Sort of thing. But it just really highlighted, it really made me think a lot, right? This was very unintentional, right? On Twitter, for example, I had to put my safety setting on, because I just didn't, every once in a while you get this thing that you really don't want to be seeing at all, like remotely, right? So anyway, it must be incredibly easy for children, and they will not have that. I mean, I'm just remembering myself as a kid. Like you'd be like, oh, well, what is this? Let's check this out. You wouldn't have that.
Oh yeah.
In many cases, that barrier, right?
Well, kids are very naturally impulsive. Like, they're not thinking through the long-term consequences, and they're naturally curious. And so big porn, to me, is preying on kids' natural curiosity. They're putting this content out all over social media. There's a symbiosis between pornography sites and adult apps like OnlyFans and social media. These porn performers and porn websites are actually going to social media to recruit new users. And so it's very easy for a kid to stumble across it and to think, oh, what is that? And just click on a link without even thinking further. Because as I mentioned, their prefrontal cortex, which is that part of our brain responsible for our self-control, our impulse control, emotional regulation, isn't fully developed till the age of 25. To me, it's tragic that these children whose brains are not fully developed are being thrust into a very adult online world without the ability to handle it. And I've summarized this as saying the great digital paradox is that kids have access to adult content more than ever before in human history, the kind of world that they're thrust into online.
If I may, they have access to all sorts of adult content that adults haven't had access to throughout history.
This is unprecedented levels, never before seen in history because of the technology, and at the same time, children have never been less prepared to handle it because their brains are not fully developed, and actually accessing the kind of social media technology, the constant dopamine hits that they're getting is stunting the brain's ability to develop that prefrontal cortex. It is the reward circuitry of the brain is really overtaking the prefrontal cortex, that emotional and self-control aspects. The technologies have been designed to hijack our brain's natural vulnerabilities, and so it's being wired a certain way that is detrimental to their well-being and to their long-term success in life.
And they're also getting, mixed messages in many cases about how to deal with such things.
Yes.
Right? So I'm just saying, like, there's this sort of snowball effect of multiple factors that might get someone in through that door and start getting hooked.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes. Let me give you a few examples, because I think it's helpful to try to understand, like, what exactly are we talking about. The online world today, like, not even the most extreme, pornographic websites, but just taking social media like Snapchat or TikTok is full of this type of sexualized content, and it's sending a message. Like, to me, we have to understand that the medium is the message, and the message that this medium of social media, the way it's designed for likes and followers, is sexualized and is trying to send the message that sex is normal, including for children, including violent, aggressive sex. And so what's happening is children are on social media, they want likes, they want followers, and they're incentivized to post very sexualized photos of themselves. And they think it's normal because the content that they're taking in is very sexualized. And the porn companies and the big tech companies are really hijacking children's vulnerabilities. And it's happening on apps that I don't think parents are fully aware of, the harm that's on there. Like in Snapchat, which is, a very common, popular app for young kids, within 4 clicks, a child can get to Pornhub. The kind of For You feeds page often advertise these types of content. And the parental controls don't work inside of the apps. If you've installed a filter on the phone, you've activated the setting that says, I don't want them to be able to access adult websites. What parents don't realize is there are browsers within the social media apps. And if a child clicks on a Pornhub link inside of Snapchat, they'll be brought to Pornhub's page all within the app. And that's something that the parent can't see into, and the filter is not given access to work inside of the app. And so with a smartphone and just hundreds of apps, there are just thousands of portals to this type of content that are incredibly difficult for parents to oversee effectively. And so it really is a dire situation. And so that's why a lot of my work focuses also on trying to help pass better laws to back parents up and to protect our kids.
Claire, we're going to take a quick break right now, and we'll be right back.
Or will timeless truths? Fathom the Good equips children with wisdom against the world. Our homeschool curriculum teaches high schoolers to think critically. We provide primary texts, original content, reasoning tools, and mentoring videos to help them transform America. Teach your children to navigate the world's woke confusion. Teach them to fathom the good.
Of the Technology and Human Flourishing Project at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. My sense is that this is a really big issue, but you just never really see it on the surface. Like you come across it randomly, but it's not something that's really talked about. And frankly, this Thomas Crooks connection is the first time I've seen it talked about in a while. It just doesn't come up often.
Yeah.
It seems, right? Or am I right?
No, I think part of the thing that's difficult about pornography is there's this kind of, stigma to it. And I think it's difficult because it is such a sensitive topic to be discussed publicly. But I think if we're going to actually protect children and make a difference, we have to be willing to have the hard conversations. And I think because of how ubiquitous it is, often, people feel implicated by it. And I'll just give this statistic to kind of help us understand. An Australian study in 2017 of 15 to 29-year-old men just asked about pornography use, and 100% of them had seen or viewed pornography. They could not find a single man in that 15 to 29-year-old survey that they did, and I can't remember the exact amount, but it was a large survey that had not seen or come across this. And so I think to the point about how the smartphone and the internet and social media have changed the nature of this, everyone is affected. Everyone has come across this or seen it. And unfortunately, because it is so addictive, it can just very easily hook people and draw them in. And it becomes a really just shameful kind of struggle that people don't even know how to talk about, the fact that they feel so drawn and addicted to this. And I think that is kind of the power of it. The really kind of sad power is that when it hooks and addicts people, it makes it very difficult for them to reach out for help or to talk about this publicly. And I think people often feel, guilt or shame for their addiction. And I really feel for them. And I'm not trying to shame people who have become addicted to pornography, but to try to say it's actually not your fault. It's big porn has designed it this way to prey on our human weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And so we have to be willing to kind of take them on to get to the root of the problem and say, yes, we want to shut down people's access for kids, trying to make it as difficult to access as possible. But we have to really go to the root of the problem, which is addressing the kind of the porn companies, and in order to really help people to become freed from this. Because I just anecdotally know lots of people who have struggled for years, and they're actively trying to fight it. And to do so, they basically have to lock down all their devices, just like a drug addict is drawn to it, and they can't even taste like a sip of alcohol. If they were an alcoholic, it's a kind of they must kind of completely shut off access. But it's difficult when it's the internet.
And have some sort of accountability system, like, the Alcoholics Anonymous or something of that nature. I can imagine, as you're describing this, I'm just sort of imagining like what might work for people.
Yes.
To
Yes, and I think, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but, addiction scientists, how they define, like, what is addictive is by how much dopamine this activity or this substance releases is how addictive it is. So drugs like heroin or cocaine are, like, highly addictive because it releases a very high, unnatural amount of dopamine. And studies have found that pornography, online, internet, kind of interactive pornography has a very similar effect, where it releases a very high level, unnatural amount of dopamine, which means that it's inherently addicting. Because what dopamine does is, as I mentioned, creates craving. And so then, as soon as they've seen it, they want to click to watch more. They want the next kind of hit. And so I think we do have to really treat this as a very addictive substance and think about regulating it the same way we have regulated alcohol, tobacco, drugs, other addictive things that we know that it's difficult for people to resist, but it's harmful to their health, it's harmful to their development, particularly children. And so we have to think about ways to try to cut off the root of how people are getting access to this. But it's very difficult when it's the internet and it's something that's in our pockets, 24/7.
Mm-hmm. Well, if we're talking about dopamine, I can't help but think of, the good product, oxytocin, right?
Yeah.
When we're talking about this, right, you can't help but think really a lot of this has to do with the fact that the device is with you all the time. It makes it harder for you to have those human relationships, which in turn also drives that cycle. Like you just see people walking around with their phones, or you see, there's these, photos of, family, everyone sitting there staring at their phone.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, so there's a real difference between dopamine and oxytocin, which Arthur Brooks has mentioned in his studies. He studies happiness. And so, both of them, both dopamine and oxytocin are, related to pleasure, like pleasure hormones. But dopamine really just creates a craving so that you do that activity again that gave you that experience of pleasure. It actually doesn't create satisfaction in the brain. So it's actually just creating a constant craving for more and more and more. Whereas oxytocin, which we get from real life interactions, that hormone is released from eye contact, physical touch. It's actually the hormone that bonds us to other humans. It bonds mothers to their babies. It bonds husband and wife. It bonds friends, because we're interacting and we're experiencing oxytocin when we're in person together with eye contact and physical touch. And it helps create bonds of trust and mutual love and responsibility that we really need to survive and thrive as a civilization. The online world does not produce oxytocin. It produces these shallow connections, not real relationships, and it's all based around dopamine. And so kids are, every time they get a like on their post or a new follower, they get a little hit of dopamine that draws them back for more. And so I've tried to explain this to parents and policymakers that when you talk about, we'll just put screen time limits in place, the screen time limit isn't sufficient in the sense that even if they're on for 15 minutes a day, they're going to be constantly craving more. And it's actually, the online world will dominate their mental space the rest of the day. They're going to be thinking about who else liked my photo, or maybe someone else, started following me. I have to go on and check. It's like this constant urge to go on and see and get that next hit of dopamine. And pornography does the same thing. The pornography creates this dopamine response, and so you just want to go view more. It's never enough. There's never satisfaction. And so what I am concerned about from a civilizational standpoint is that we're wiring these kids to become dopamine addicts and dopamine addicted users to social media or to online pornography, and they're not able to form relationships in real life. And there's been studies done that show that oxytocin isn't released through the screen. Like even on a Zoom call, you're actually not getting oxytocin, even if you're talking to someone through the screen. It's something that can only happen in the real world. And if we're allowing kids to inhabit the virtual world, and that's where they're growing up, is completely online, then I worry about what that means for the formation of marriages and families, these building blocks of civilization in the long run. If kids aren't able to learn and develop how to form relationships in the real world, and relationships that bring really true happiness and satisfaction. I think that is something that we're seeing is there's this epidemic, rising rates of loneliness, anxiety, and depression, but yet kids are more connected than ever. And it's because the kind of connection is so shallow. It's all based on this dopamine that just creates craving for more that doesn't actually bring satisfaction and happiness. And so thinking about what do we want for our kids? We want their long-term success and happiness. And so we need to focus on helping them inhabit the real world and form real life relationships. And on this is the last point I'll say on this is that long-term, like longitudinal studies that have been done of happiness show that the number one predictor of like success as an adult and kind of life satisfaction is actually childhood self-control. That amongst all these other factors, that people who learned and developed self-control as children, the kind of ability for delayed gratification, are the happiest adults. And social media and online pornography in particular just undermines that ability to develop delayed gratification and self-control. And so we're really eroding any type of foundation that we would want to build for a long-term life of happiness.
You're basically saying that pornography is just sort of like a heightened version of what a lot of the interactions they have online are doing anyway, like just the most extreme version. But this is basically, foundationally preventing a lot of normal human interaction. And then if that's happening in an early stage of the brain coming together, we don't even have any idea of what the impact will be, but it does create a certain level of isolation. You already know that from what you've told me. So this is very troubling, let's say, right?
It is. It's very troubling. Yeah, and I think kids are inherently habit forming. Like we think about childhood, we're trying to help them develop habits that will make them an independent, successful adult. And allowing them to become habituated towards screens really just caves them in on themselves. It's creating dependency and addiction to these devices or to the kinds of terrible content that they're coming across online. So I think that's something to really pay attention to. Children are being shaped and influenced by something. They're always being formed. And so what are we allowing them to be formed by?
Well, this is something we're definitely going to be covering a lot more on American Thought Leaders. Claire Morrell, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
Thank you so much, Jan.
Thank you all for joining Claire Morrell and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.